It was a regular Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C., when the small corner diner on 14th Street was humming with its usual lunchtime energy. The place wasn't fancy, just your typical American diner with checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and the constant aroma of fresh coffee and grilled sandwiches in the air. The regulars loved it for its home-style cooking and the fact that it felt like a slice of old-school D.C., unchanged by time and politics. Around 2 p.m., when the lunch rush was winding down and the staff was catching their breath, Vice President Kamala Harris walked in quietly through the glass door. The little bell above the entrance chimed softly, but nobody paid much attention at first. She wasn't surrounded by her usual security detail. They remained discreetly outside, and she was dressed casually in a blazer and slacks, carrying a thick folder of papers under her arm. The vice president chose a corner booth near the window, where the afternoon sun created warm patches of light on the worn table surface. She settled in quietly, spreading out some briefing papers, looking like any other professional trying to catch up on work during a late lunch break. The diner was still about half full, with a mix of office workers, locals, and a few tourists who were too absorbed in their own meals and conversations to notice who had just joined them. A new waitress, who had only been working at the diner for 2 weeks, approached the booth with her usual friendly smile. She was a college student working part-time to pay for her studies, and while she kept up with politics, she hadn't expected to find herself serving one of the most powerful people in the country. Something about the customer seemed familiar to her, but in the middle of a busy shift, with a million things on her mind, she didn't make the connection. "Welcome to Pete's Diner. Can I start you off with some coffee?" she asked cheerfully, pulling out her notepad. Her name tag was slightly crooked on her blue uniform, and her hands were a bit shaky from the busy lunch service, but her smile was genuine and warm. The vice president looked up with a kind smile and was about to respond when the diner's manager, who had been watching the interaction from behind the counter, suddenly realized who was sitting in his establishment. His face turned red, and his eyes widened in panic. He quickly rushed over, nearly knocking over a stack of menus in his haste. The quiet afternoon atmosphere was about to change dramatically, and nobody in the diner could have predicted how the next few minutes would unfold. The simple act of a vice president wanting a quiet moment with a cup of coffee was about to turn into something much more significant, a moment that would teach everyone present an unexpected lesson about dignity, respect, and true leadership. The sun continued to stream through the windows, the coffee machine hissed in the background, and the old ceiling fans spun lazily above. It was just another day at Pete's Diner, but it was about to become a day that nobody present would ever forget. The stage was set for what would become a powerful example of how small moments can create big changes, and how true character reveals itself not in grand speeches, but in simple, everyday interactions. The story was just beginning, and all around the diner, people went about their business, unaware that they were about to witness something remarkable, not because of who was involved, but because of what it would teach them about human dignity and respect. What happened next at Pete's Diner would be talked about for months to come. The manager, still red-faced and flustered, rushed up to the booth like a tornado in a pressed white shirt. His footsteps were so heavy that the silverware on nearby tables rattled. "Oh my goodness, Madam Vice President," he practically shouted, making several customers jump in their seats. "I am so terribly sorry about this." The young waitress stood frozen, her notepad still in hand, as the reality of who she'd been casually greeting dawned on her. Her cheeks flushed pink, and she clutched her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. But before she could say anything, the manager's voice cut through the air like a knife. "How dare you treat the Vice President of the United States like any regular customer?" He scolded the waitress, loud enough for everyone to hear. The poor girl's eyes began to well up with tears. "Don't you watch the news? Don't you know who this is?" His voice grew louder with each question, drawing uncomfortable stares from other diners. The lunch crowd had gone completely silent. You could hear the ice cubes clinking in water glasses and the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. An elderly couple in the next booth exchanged concerned glances. A businessman reading his newspaper slowly lowered it to watch the scene unfold. The waitress tried to apologize, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." But the manager wasn't finished. He continued his tirade, talking about proper protocol and respect, though his own behavior showed little of either. His hands were waving wildly as he spoke, his face getting redder by the second. Other staff members peered nervously from behind the counter. The cook stopped flipping burgers to watch through the service window. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Some customers started gathering their things, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. Throughout all this, Vice President Harris sat quietly, observing the situation with careful eyes. Her expression was calm but focused, like someone working out a complex puzzle. She placed her pen down beside her untouched briefing papers and slowly folded her hands on the table. The manager was still going on about proper service standards when the vice president cleared her throat softly. It wasn't a loud sound, but somehow it cut through all the chaos like a beam of light through fog. The manager stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes in the diner turned toward her booth. She hadn't raised her voice or made any dramatic gestures. She didn't need to. There was something about her presence, about the way she carried herself in that moment, that commanded attention without demanding it. The afternoon sun streaming through the window created a gentle glow around her as she prepared to address the situation. The diner had become so quiet you could hear the old ceiling fan squeaking above. Everyone waited, watching, wondering how the vice president would handle this uncomfortable situation. The waitress was still standing there, trying her best to maintain composure, while the manager's face had shifted from red to pale in a matter of seconds. Nobody could have predicted what happened next, but everyone present would remember it as a masterclass in grace under pressure. The vice president was about to transform an uncomfortable moment into something much more meaningful. A lesson about dignity, respect, and true leadership that would resonate far beyond the walls of Pete's Diner. Vice President Harris stood up slowly from her booth, smoothing her blazer with a gentle touch. Her movement was deliberate and calm, like a teacher preparing to address a classroom. Every eye in Pete's Diner followed her as she took 2 steps forward, positioning herself between the trembling waitress and the now silent manager. "You know," she began, her voice warm but firm, carrying just enough weight to hold everyone's attention. "When I was younger, I worked as a waitress too." A few surprised murmurs rippled through the diner. The vice president smiled, genuine and kind. "It was at a small restaurant, not unlike this one. And I remember my first week on the job like it was yesterday." She turned slightly to include everyone in the conversation, as if sharing a story with old friends. "I dropped 3 plates in one day," she continued, chuckling softly. "And I mixed up so many orders that my manager at the time probably wanted to pull his hair out." The tension in the air began to dissolve as several customers smiled, nodding in recognition of their own first job memories. The young waitress's shoulders relaxed slightly, and even the manager's stern expression began to soften. Vice President Harris gestured toward one of the empty chairs, inviting both of them to sit. The simple act transformed the confrontation into a conversation. "But you know what I learned from that experience?" she asked, pulling up a chair herself. The afternoon sun caught the silver in her hair as she leaned forward slightly. "I learned that how we treat people when they're learning, when they're trying their best, says more about us than it does about them." The manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier anger replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. The vice president continued, her voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "Leadership isn't about making people feel small when they make mistakes. It's about lifting them up, showing them the way forward." She turned to the waitress, who was wiping away a tear with the corner of her apron. "You approached me with genuine warmth and kindness. You treated me like a human being first, and that's exactly what I needed today." The girl's eyes widened in surprise, and a small, hopeful smile appeared on her face. Then the vice president addressed the manager directly, but her words were meant for everyone listening. In times like these, when our country feels so divided, it's these small moments of human connection that matter most. Whether someone is serving coffee or running a country, they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The cook had abandoned his grill completely now, leaning through the service window with rapt attention. Other customers had turned their chairs to listen better. An older woman in the corner was nodding vigorously, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "I didn't come here today as the vice president," she continued, gesturing to her briefing papers still sitting in the booth. "I came here as someone looking for a quiet place to work, maybe enjoy a cup of coffee, and experience a little bit of normal life. And that's exactly what I got, until we forgot that we're all just people trying our best." Her words hung in the air for a moment, simple but profound. The ceiling fans kept spinning, the coffee maker hissed softly in the background, and somewhere in the kitchen a timer dinged quietly. But the atmosphere in the diner had changed completely. What had started as a moment of humiliation had transformed into something much more meaningful. A lesson about humanity, dignity, and the true nature of leadership. The vice president wasn't finished yet, though. She had one more thing to say, something that would change not just the day, but the entire culture of Pete's Diner. And as she prepared to speak again, everyone present knew they were witnessing something truly special, a moment when true leadership showed itself in the most unexpected place. Vice President Harris stood up slowly from her booth, smoothing her blazer with a gentle touch. Her movement was deliberate and calm, like a teacher preparing to address a classroom. Every eye in Pete's Diner followed her as she took 2 steps forward, positioning herself between the trembling waitress and the now silent manager. "You know," she began, her voice warm but firm, carrying just enough weight to hold everyone's attention. "When I was younger, I worked as a waitress too." A few surprised murmurs rippled through the diner. The vice president smiled, genuine and kind. "It was at a small restaurant, not unlike this one. And I remember my first week on the job like it was yesterday." She turned slightly to include everyone in the conversation, as if sharing a story with old friends. "I dropped 3 plates in one day," she continued, chuckling softly. "And I mixed up so many orders that my manager at the time probably wanted to pull his hair out." The tension in the air began to dissolve as several customers smiled, nodding in recognition of their own first job memories. The young waitress's shoulders relaxed slightly, and even the manager's stern expression began to soften. Vice President Harris gestured toward one of the empty chairs, inviting both of them to sit. The simple act transformed the confrontation into a conversation. "But you know what I learned from that experience?" she asked, pulling up a chair herself. The afternoon sun caught the silver in her hair as she leaned forward slightly. "I learned that how we treat people when they're learning, when they're trying their best, says more about us than it does about them." The manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier anger replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. The vice president continued, her voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "Leadership isn't about making people feel small when they make mistakes. It's about lifting them up, showing them the way forward." She turned to the waitress, who was wiping away a tear with the corner of her apron. "You approached me with genuine warmth and kindness. You treated me like a human being first, and that's exactly what I needed today." The girl's eyes widened in surprise, and a small, hopeful smile appeared on her face. Then the vice president addressed the manager directly, but her words were meant for everyone listening. In times like these, when our country feels so divided, it's these small moments of human connection that matter most. Whether someone is serving coffee or running a country, they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The cook had abandoned his grill completely now, leaning through the service window with rapt attention. Other customers had turned their chairs to listen better. An older woman in the corner was nodding vigorously, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "I didn't come here today as the vice president," she continued, gesturing to her briefing papers still sitting in the booth. "I came here as someone looking for a quiet place to work, maybe enjoy a cup of coffee, and experienced a little bit of normal life. And that's exactly what I got. Until we forgot that we're all just people trying our best." Her words hung in the air for a moment, simple but profound. The ceiling fans kept spinning. The coffee maker hissed softly in the background. And somewhere in the kitchen a timer dinged quietly. But the atmosphere in the diner had changed completely. What had started as a moment of humiliation had transformed into something much more meaningful. A lesson about humanity, dignity, and the true nature of leadership. The vice president wasn't finished yet, though. She had one more thing to say, something that would change not just the day, but the entire culture of Pete's Diner. And as she prepared to speak again, everyone present knew they were witnessing something truly special. A moment when true leadership showed itself in the most unexpected place. The young waitress took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, finding new confidence as she clicked her pen. "What can I get for you today?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. The vice president smiled warmly and ordered a simple black coffee and a slice of apple pie, the diner's specialty. As the waitress walked away to fulfill the order, the vice president turned back to the manager, who was still sitting quietly, processing everything that had happened. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about something we could all learn from this moment." The afternoon crowd had thinned out a bit, but those who remained were completely captivated. A group of construction workers who had come in for a late lunch sat with their hard hats on the counter, completely forgotten. An elderly couple who had been about to leave had settled back into their booth, their car keys lying untouched on the table. "In my years of public service," the vice president continued, her voice carrying just enough to reach everyone without seeming like she was making a speech, "I've learned that the most important changes often start in the most ordinary places. Like right here, in this diner." The manager leaned forward slightly, his earlier embarrassment giving way to genuine interest. The other staff members had drawn closer too, forming a loose circle around the conversation. Even the busy busboy had stopped clearing tables to listen. "What if," she suggested, picking up a paper napkin and smoothing it on the table, "we use this moment to create something positive? Not just for today, but for everyone who walks through those doors." She gestured toward the diner's entrance, where the afternoon sun was creating patterns on the floor through the blinds. The young waitress returned with the coffee and pie, setting them down carefully. Instead of hurrying away, she stayed, now part of the growing circle of people drawn into this unexpected moment of change. "Every person who works here," the vice president continued, taking a sip of her coffee, "has their own story, their own dreams, their own challenges. Just like every customer who walks in that door." She paused to taste the pie, her face lighting up with genuine appreciation. "This is excellent, by the way." The cook beamed from his spot in the kitchen window, pride momentarily overtaking his curiosity about where this conversation was heading. The simple compliment seemed to shift the energy in the room even further, making what came next feel natural and possible. "What if we created a workplace where everyone feels valued?" she asked, looking around the circle. "Where mistakes are seen as opportunities to learn, not reasons to humiliate. Where leadership means lifting people up instead of tearing them down." The manager was nodding slowly now, his earlier harsh demeanor completely transformed. One of the older waitresses wiped away a tear with the corner of her apron, while the young waitress stood a little straighter, her eyes bright with possibility. The vice president took another bite of pie before continuing, treating this conversation like a chat among friends rather than a lecture from a high-ranking official. The simple act of sharing food in conversation had created a connection that no formal speech could have achieved. Around them, the diner continued its gentle hum, coffee brewing, dishes clinking, the door chime occasionally announcing new customers. But something was different now. The air felt lighter, charged with possibility. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation was blossoming into something unexpected and beautiful. a moment of real change, born in the most ordinary of places. And as the vice president prepared to share her final thoughts, everyone present knew they were part of something special. A transformation that would ripple out far beyond the walls of Pete's Diner, touching lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Setting her fork down beside the half-eaten slice of apple pie, Vice President Harris pulled a small notebook from her blazer pocket. "You know what makes a place like this special?" she asked, looking around at the gathered faces. "It's not just the food, though this pie is truly remarkable. It's the people who make it feel like home." The cook puffed up with pride at the pie compliment, while others nodded in agreement. The young waitress had taken a seat at the edge of the group, her order pad now filled with notes she'd been taking throughout the conversation. "Let me share something with you," the vice president continued, opening her notebook. "In every workplace I've visited, from small diners to big corporations, I've noticed that the most successful ones all have something in common. They treat every role with respect, from the person washing dishes to the person signing the checks." The dishwasher, who had been listening quietly from the kitchen doorway, stood a little taller. His hands were still soapy, but he'd been so drawn into the conversation that he'd forgotten about the sink full of dishes waiting for him. "What if," she suggested, writing something in her notebook, "we started with a simple change? Maybe a morning meeting where everyone can share their ideas, where the newest employee feels just as valued as the most experienced." She looked directly at the manager as she spoke, her expression encouraging rather than accusatory. The manager, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly sat up straighter. We could start tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying a new warmth. "Maybe over coffee, before the morning rush?" Several staff members nodded enthusiastically at this suggestion. The elderly couple in the corner booth, who had been listening intently, smiled at each other. The husband whispered something to his wife, who nodded and raised her hand like a student in class. "We've been coming here for 20 years, she said, her voice gentle but clear. "And I've never been prouder to be a customer than I am today." The vice president smiled warmly at the couple, then turned back to the group. "Change doesn't always need grand gestures or fancy programs," she said, tearing a page from her notebook. "Sometimes it starts with something as simple as asking someone how their day is going, or remembering that everyone was new once." She began writing on the paper, her pen moving quickly but carefully. "I'm going to leave you with something," she said, still writing. "Not a set of rules or regulations, but a reminder. A reminder that every person who walks through that door, whether they're serving coffee or drinking it, deserves to be treated with dignity." The afternoon light has shifted again, creating long shadows across the diner's checkered floor. The coffee in cups had grown cold, forgotten in the intensity of the moment. Even the construction workers, who had long since finished their late lunch, remained seated at the counter, their hard hats still untouched. The young waitress leaned forward to peek at what the vice president was writing. Her eyes widened slightly, and a small smile spread across her face. The other staff members moved closer too, drawn by curiosity and the sense that they were witnessing something important. The paper the vice president was working on wasn't a formal document or an official memo. Instead, it was something much more personal and meaningful. A message that would soon hang on the diner's wall, changing not just how the staff treated each other, but how every customer who walked through the door would feel. As she finished writing, the vice president looked up at the gathered faces around her. The atmosphere in Pete's Diner had transformed completely from the tension of earlier. Now it was filled with something else: hope, possibility, and the quiet excitement that comes with knowing things are about to change for the better. The vice president held up the handwritten note, her message clear and bold against the white paper. "In this diner," she read aloud, "every person has a story worth hearing, a voice worth listening to, and dignity worth protecting." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Would you like me to continue?" Everyone nodded eagerly. The young waitress had her phone ready to capture every word, while the manager had pulled out the small notebook he usually used for inventory counts. Every mistake is a chance to learn. The vice president continued reading. Every challenge an opportunity to grow, and every day a new chance to lift each other up. In this place, we don't just serve food. We serve hope, kindness, and respect to everyone who walks through our doors. The cook wiped his eyes with his sleeve, not caring that several customers could see him getting emotional. The older waitress reached over and squeezed his shoulder gently, her own eyes glistening with tears. And remember, the vice president read the final lines, her voice warm and sincere. The most important ingredient in everything we serve is the humanity we share. Treat each person as you would want your own family treated, with patience, understanding, and grace. She stood up slowly, smoothing the paper before handing it to the manager. This isn't just a note, she explained. It's a promise. A promise to yourselves and to each other. The manager accepted the paper with both hands, treating it like a precious document. The elderly couple who had been watching everything unfold started a quiet applause, which quickly spread through the diner. Even the construction workers at the counter joined in, their rough hands creating a gentle thunder of appreciation. The young waitress, who had been a center of the day's events, suddenly spoke up. Could we make copies? One for the kitchen, one for the break room. Her voice was stronger now, confident in a way it hadn't been earlier. Better yet, the manager added, his entire demeanor transformed. We could frame it. Put it right by the entrance where everyone can see it. He looked at the vice president. Would that be okay? Vice President Harris smiled warmly. It's not my message anymore, she said, gesturing to everyone in the room. It belongs to all of you now. Make it your own, add to it, let it grow with your diner. The afternoon sun was casting long golden rays through the windows now, creating a warm glow throughout the diner. The usual sounds had returned. The clinking of dishes, the hum of conversation, the sizzle from the grill. But they seemed different somehow, more harmonious. A young family walked in, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. Without missing a beat, the entire staff seemed to straighten up, ready to put their new understanding into practice. The young waitress caught the manager's eye, and he nodded encouragingly, gesturing for her to greet the new customers. The vice president gathered her briefing papers, tucking them back into their folder. She'd gotten no work done, but something far more important had been accomplished. As she prepared to leave, she could already see small changes taking shape. The way the staff smiled at each other, the gentle tone in the manager's voice as he spoke to the dishwasher, the confident stride of the young waitress as she welcomed the new family. What had started as a simple stop for coffee had transformed into something much more meaningful. And as the day wound down at Pete's Diner, everyone present knew they'd been part of something special. A moment when simple words on paper became a catalyst for real change. Before leaving, Vice President Harris stood by the counter, reaching for her wallet to pay for her coffee and pie. The manager quickly stepped forward, insisting that it was on the house, but she shook her head with a gentle smile. Part of treating everyone with respect, she said, pulling out a crisp bill, is allowing them to do their job properly. She handed the payment to the young waitress. And I believe this belongs to you. The waitress accepted it with steady hands, no longer trembling as she had been earlier. The vice president then did something unexpected. She pulled out a business card and wrote a personal number on the back. This isn't for emergencies or politics, she explained, handing it to the waitress. It's because I want to know how your story unfolds. Call me in a month and let me know how the changes are working out. Around them, the diner had sprung back to life, but with a noticeably different energy. The cook was showing the dishwasher a better way to stack plates that would be easier on his back. The older waitress was quietly explaining some service tricks to a newer server, her tone patient and encouraging. The manager, still holding the framed message, was already making plans. We could start with morning meetings tomorrow, he said, his voice carrying excitement rather than authority. just 15 minutes before the breakfast rush. Everyone can share their ideas, their concerns. He looked around at his staff, seeing them with new eyes. A delivery driver who had walked in during the last few minutes stood by the door, taking in the scene. The young waitress immediately noticed him and walked over with a fresh glass of water. "You must be tired from your route," she said kindly. "Take a minute to rest while I get your order ready." The vice president watched this interaction with approval, noting how quickly the lessons of the day were already being put into practice. As she gathered her things, she overheard snippets of conversation that told her the change was real. Two construction workers were leaving a larger tip than usual, quietly discussing how they'd never really thought about what their servers went through. The elderly couple was telling the manager about their 20 years of visiting the diner, sharing stories about their favorite waiters from the past. Near the kitchen, the cook was teaching a new busboy the proper way to carry heavy trays, showing the same patience that had just been shown to others. "Everyone starts somewhere," he said, echoing the vice president's earlier words. "The important thing is that we help each other along the way." The manager had found a perfect spot for the framed message, right where everyone, staff and customers alike, would see it as they entered. He was carefully wiping the glass, making sure every word was clearly visible. The afternoon light caught the frame, making the words seem to glow. As the vice president prepared to step out into the late afternoon sunshine, she took one last look around the diner. The young waitress, who had been at the center of everything, caught her eye and smiled, not the nervous smile from earlier, but one full of confidence and hope. Outside, her security detail was waiting patiently, but they too could sense that something significant had happened inside Pete's diner. The usual political formality had given way to something more genuine and human. The bell of the door chimed as she opened it, but this time it seemed to ring with a different tone, like it was announcing not just another customer leaving, but the beginning of something new. The simple act of getting coffee had turned into a moment of transformation, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest places. Behind her, Pete's diner hummed with renewed purpose, its ordinary evening routine now infused with extraordinary meaning. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. 1 month later, Pete's diner had transformed in ways no one could have imagined. The changes weren't in the physical space. The checkered floor was still the same. The coffee still brewed in the old machine, and the ceiling fans still squeaked occasionally. The real change was in the atmosphere, in how people treated each other. The young waitress, keeping her promise, had called the vice president's office exactly 1 month after that memorable afternoon. Her voice was steady and confident as she shared the news of how things had evolved at the diner. The morning meetings had become a cherished tradition. Each day started with the staff gathering around a large table, sharing coffee and ideas. The manager had replaced his old suggestion box with an ideas and dreams board, where both staff and customers could pin their thoughts about making the diner even better. The cook had started an informal mentoring program, teaching new kitchen staff not just about food preparation, but about the dignity of their work. "Every plate that leaves this kitchen," he would say, "carries a little bit of hope with it." The older waitress had begun keeping a journal of customer stories, little moments of kindness she witnessed throughout her shifts. "Yesterday," she wrote, "a businessman gave up his seat for a pregnant woman during the lunch rush, then waited an extra 20 minutes without complaining. The dishwasher, who had previously worked in silence, now joined the morning meetings with ideas about improving the kitchen workflow. His suggestions had already made everyone's job easier, and his quiet confidence grew with each passing day." Regular customers noticed the change too. The construction workers who had witnessed the vice president's visit now made Pete's their daily stop, not just for the food, but for the warmth they felt every time they walked through the door. They'd even started a tradition of leaving encouraging notes for the staff along with their tips. The elderly couple who had been coming for 20 years told everyone who would listen of the day things changed at Pete's diner. "It's like watching a family grow," the wife would say, her eyes twinkling. "And we feel like we're part of it." The framed message near the entrance had inspired others. Customers began adding their own notes of appreciation on a bulletin board nearby. "Thank you for making my lonely mornings less lonely," read one. "Your kindness helped me through my hardest days," said another. The manager had changed the most. His morning greeting now included asking each staff member about their dreams and goals. He'd helped 3 employees enroll in night classes at the local community college, arranging schedules to accommodate their studies. The young waitress had started taking political science classes, inspired by her encounter with the vice president. But more than that, she'd found her voice. She became known for making new employees feel welcome, remembering the day when a simple mistake could have crushed her spirit, but instead led to transformation. Local news had picked up the story not because of the vice president's visit, but because of what Pete's Diner had become. A model of how workplace kindness could transform a community. Other businesses in the neighborhood began sending their managers to have coffee there, hoping to understand the secret to their success. As the young waitress finished sharing these updates over the phone, the vice president listened with a warm smile. This was the kind of change that lasted, not because it came from the top down, but because it grew from the heart outward. The story of Pete's Diner became more than just a tale about a chance encounter with a vice president. It became a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a simple cup of coffee, a moment of understanding, and the courage to treat each person with the dignity they deserve. And in Washington, D.C., where big decisions were made every day, a small diner had proved that the greatest leadership lessons sometimes come served with a side of apple pie and a whole lot of heart.